Chapter 3 Spare Parts. Very, very early the next morning, David was to be found hunched over a number of old can and bottle boxes near the incinerator at the bottom of the Topman garden. Dr. Topman had cleaned out the garage on Sunday, and when that happened, no sensible person would believe the number of perfectly good things that got thrown away. Now began such a rattling and scraping and banging that John, the rooster, and Mrs. Pennyfeather, his wife, craned their necks and stared, and their children all ran up to the fence of the chicken yard and stretched out their beaks in amazement. Up from those old can and bottle boxes there flew all sorts of odds and ends. "Nope, don't think so," David would mutter to himself, for he had a surprisingly clear picture in his head of exactly what he needed. Then, excitedly, like a dog digging for a bone, "Yip, yip, just the thing for the instrument panel." Now there will be the absolute silence while he sat back on his heels and pondered over an old cogwheel or a coiled-up spring covered with graphite. Then presently, "Oh boy, a barometer! Now what do you suppose Pop threw away that for? It's broken, but I bet you it could be fixed. And here's a toggle switch. At least I think it's a toggle switch. Then I've got to have a pressure gauge. Very important. Can't get along without a pressure gauge." This went on for quite a while, and just about the time David had all the spare parts he needed, who should come along but Chuck Masterson. Chuck could be a lot of fun and very helpful sometimes, but other times Chuck was stubborn. Just let David get an idea about how something should be done, and Chuck would think it should be done just the opposite way, and he wouldn't give in. He'd say David was stubborn and wouldn't give in either, so there were days when they never got anywhere. All the same, they were the best of friends. They were in the same grade at school. David was tall and quick, with freckles and some bleached brown hair that flopped over his eyebrows. Chuck was shorter and squarer, with brown skin and dark hair. David liked to plan things and draw and talk, but Chuck just liked to get right in and do them without saying much. Right now, Chuck's father and mother were away on a trip, so Chuck and Captain Tom were living alone. "What you doing?" said Chuck. David turned up his streaked and sweaty face and squinted at Chuck sideways. He seemed to consider something with great seriousness and then finally to make up his mind. "Chuck," he began solemnly, "have you and Captain talked much lately about spaceships and traveling to the moon and life on other planets and all that?" "Sure," said Chuck, "lots of times." Now David stood up, leaned close to Chuck, and stopped a moment before he spoke very, very slowly, with stern and narrowed gaze. "Did he read out to you a piece in the paper last night about a small spaceship being wanted by a certain Mr. Tico M. Bass? A little notice printed in green?" Chuck's eyes grew big. "A spaceship? Gee willikers, no." "He didn't say a word?" "Nope, but if he'd seen it, he would have." You see, Captain Tom believed in all sorts of things, flying saucers and such as that, and sometimes he'd stand out on the beach at night and stare up into the dark sky for minutes at a time to see if he could spot anything, but he never had. All the same, Captain Tom loved to yarn about discoveries in space and flying to the moon and what life on space stations would be like just as much as he loved to yarn about the weird things that had happened to him at sea. "Well, listen, Chuck," said David. "It's a kind of mystery because my father says there is no such street as Thallow Street, the place that you have to bring your spaceship when it's finished." "Then," said Chuck in his downright sensible way, "why don't we go and try to find it?" But David frowned at that and didn't answer. He just began picking out all the biggest tin cans he could find and tearing the paper off them. "Not going to," he said finally. "There's a Thallow Street somewhere, all right, or that notice wouldn't have been in the paper. Besides, it'd take too much time to go off and hunt for it, and I've got to hurry." The truth of the matter was, David didn't want to admit his real reason for not settling the mystery. You see, if there were no Thallow Street, and therefore no Mr. Bass, and therefore no reason to build the spaceship, he couldn't have stood it, because he was stuck to the idea of that spaceship as a nail is stuck to a magnet. Now he looked up at Chuck again and fixed him with a grave stare. "Chuck," he said, "would you like to go off on an adventure and have a chance to do a good deed?" "What kind of an adventure?" asked Chuck cautiously. "I don't know exactly, but I'll bet it'll have something to do with space." "I think we ought to go and find that street first," said Chuck stubbornly, "or else what's the good of beginning?" "Okay," said David, picking up his box of spare parts. "I'll just build the ship myself, and if it's the best one, I'll go off and find the adventure alone." Oh, but Chuck couldn't bear that. If there was one thing he hated more than any other, it was being left out of whatever was going on. All right, then, how do we begin?" And he looked angry, but you could tell he was going to stick until he found what all this was about. "Bring that box of tin cans, will you, Chuck?" grinned David, pleased as punch that he'd won Chuck over. I thought we could do our building back in that cave on Captain Tom's beach. Now he started away down the path leading to the sand, which stretched away in a curve at the bottom of the cliff beneath the Topman's back garden. Beyond the row of wind-twisted old Monterey cypresses that bordered the path stood Chuck's house. "Will the adventure be dangerous?" shouted Chuck all at once, hurrying along behind with his box of tin cans rattling and banging. "Will we have to go out beyond where the planes go?" "Shh!" hissed David furiously, turning on him. "It's a secret, and don't you tell anyone, because other kids might come and spy and copy our design. And don't tell Captain Tom, because he'd be full of ideas and want to help, and this is just for boys 8 to 11 with no grown-ups nosing in. Now I've got all the spare parts here, and those tin cans have to be flattened out so we can nail them to the outside of the ship. All we need is wood." Chuck stopped in the middle of the path and stared into David's box, which was full of what looked like junk. How on earth could anyone build a spaceship out of that, he wondered. He shook his head, and yet he already could feel himself beginning to think about what the adventure could be and to hope that he and David would be the ones chosen to go. But all the same, flattening out dozens of tin cans to cover the outside of the spaceship appalled him. "Hey, David," he yelled suddenly, lifting his voice sharply above the rumble of the waves that came crashing and spreading in all up and down the shore. "Listen, Dave, Captain Tom has some sheets of tin or some kind of shiny stuff over in his boathouse. Leftover pieces, all shapes. Not very big, but a lot better than tin cans. We could finish off with tin cans. And Dave, he's got all sorts of lathes and 2x4s, and he's even got some curved-up rib left from a little old sailboat that he took apart. You know, ribs steamed up just to the perfect shape of a spaceship. Dave, they'd be perfect." David caught his breath. He could scarcely believe their good luck. Curved the space of a spaceship? How many other boys in Pacific Grove or in Monterey would have grandfathers with ribs of old boats lying in their boathouses and big beautiful sheets of shining metal just waiting to be used? Maybe dozens of boys. And all of them, at this very moment, might be asking their grandfathers for the loan of those old boat ribs and those enormous metal sheets. "Oh, come on, Chuck, hurry, hurry," he cried, his voice high with impatience and urgency. "We haven't got a moment to lose. We've got to find Captain Tom. Chuck, we've got to be first." And that ends chapter 3.